Hannah Brooks walked into Caldwell with her last dollar gone. Her name dragged through the dirt, and a bruise on her cheekbone she didn't bother hiding. She didn't ask for sympathy. She asked for work. The first man she approached laughed. The second one spat at her feet. The third told her no decent woman would hire her kind. She stood in that street, chin up, dust on her boots, and she made herself a promise she would not beg and she would not break. If this story already has your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Hannah Brooks had not cried in 11 days. She had counted them. 1 for every mile she had walked after they took her horse. 2 for the night she slept in a dry creek bed with nothing but her coat pulled over her face to keep the mosquitoes off. 3, 4, 5 for the stretch of road between Millhaven and the edge of the mountain county, where the pines grew tall enough to block the afternoon sun, and the air tasted different, cleaner. Older, like something that hadn't been touched yet by the kind of men who had ruined her. She didn't know where she was going. That was the truth of it. After everything that happened in Millhaven, after the trial that wasn't really a trial, after Gerald Holt stood up in front of the whole town and called her a thief, with the kind of calm confidence that only money could buy, she had simply started walking. She had no plan. She had no money. She had a carpet bag with 2 dresses, a pocket knife, a tin cup, and a photograph of her mother she couldn't bring herself to leave behind, even when the bag got heavy enough to cut into her shoulder. Caldwell was the first real town she'd hit in 4 days. She told herself it would be different. She had told herself that 3 towns ago, too. The main street was wide and packed with summer dust and the particular kind of heat that pressed down on you from above and radiated back up from the baked earth beneath your boots so you felt cooked from both directions. People moved slowly in that heat. Women with parasols, men with hats pulled low. A dog slept in the shade of a post outside the general store. It looked smarter than anyone else on the street. Hannah squared her shoulders and walked to the first establishment that looked like it might need help, a boarding house with a hand-lettered sign in the window that read, "Meals served, clean rooms, reasonable rates." She knocked on the open door frame. A woman appeared from somewhere in the back, wiping her hands on an apron. She was stout and red-faced, and she looked at Hannah the way you look at something you almost stepped on. "Help you?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm looking for work. I can cook, I can clean, I can keep books if you need that. I'm a hard worker, and I won't give you any trouble." The woman's eyes moved over her. Not quick, slow, and deliberate the way a person takes inventory of something they're already preparing to refuse. "Where you from?" "Millhaven." The woman's expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted behind it. A door closing. "Can't help you," she said, and disappeared back into the dark of the house. Hannah stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the next place. The man at the feed store shook his head before she finished speaking. The woman at the laundry told her she'd heard about what happened in Millhaven, and she ran a respectable business. The man at the saloon, and she had lowered herself to asking there, which said something about how desperate things had gotten, looked her over with a different kind of interest entirely, the kind that made her skin crawl, and told her they didn't need more girls, but he'd be willing to make an exception. She walked out before he finished the sentence. By the time the sun had tipped past noon, she had been turned away from 7 places. She sat down on the edge of the water trough at the far end of the street and set her bag between her feet, and she looked at her hands. They were rough. They had always been rough. She had never been the kind of woman who had soft hands. She had worked since she was old enough to be useful, and she had kept working, and she had never asked anyone for anything she wasn't prepared to earn. And Gerald Holt had taken all of it. Not just the money, not just the job at the assay office where she had kept records so clean and accurate that even the mine owners admitted she was the best bookkeeper they'd ever had. He had taken her name, her reputation, her right to simply exist in a place without people looking at her like she was something contagious. She reached into her bag and pulled out the last of what she had, a biscuit she'd wrapped in cloth that morning, dry and 2 days old. She ate half of it and wrapped the other half back up. "You look like you're having a rough go of things." She looked up. The man standing beside the water trough was old enough that his face was a map of every hard summer he'd lived through, and from the look of him, there had been quite a few. He wore a beat-up hat and suspenders over a collarless shirt, and he had the kind of eyes that had been watching the world long enough to see it clearly. "I'm fine," Hannah said. "Didn't say you weren't." He lowered himself onto the edge of the trough beside her, with the careful movement of a man whose knees had opinions about such things. "Just observing." She didn't say anything. "Tried the boarding house?" he asked. "First place I went." "Mercantile?" "Mm-hmm." "The Hendersons' laundry?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "They tell you they heard about Millhaven." She looked at him sharply. He shrugged, slow and unapologetic. "Small county, miss. Word moves fast when someone wants it to." "Someone," she said. Not a question. "Fella named Holt has a cousin in Caldwell," the old man said simply. "Word got here ahead of you." Hannah looked back down at her hands. The biscuit sat in her stomach like a stone. "So there's nowhere in this town that'll take me on?" "Probably not." "And the next town?" "Ridgeback's about 18 miles east, but Holt's got business connections all the way out there." He paused. "West, though. West is different." She looked at him. "There's a man up in the mountain country." The old man pushed his hat back slightly, squinting at nothing in particular. "Runs cattle on about 400 acres up near the timberline. Don't come to town much. Don't have much use for what people say about other people." He paused again, choosing his next words with care. "Ethan Walker. Lost his family some years back, foster family, the Walkers who took him in after his own people died. Fire took them. He's been up there alone a good long while. What does he need? What does any man running 400 acres alone need?" The old man glanced at her sideways. "He's got a ranch hand who quit on him 2 weeks ago. He needs someone who can work." Hannah was quiet for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" The old man stood up, knees protesting audibly, and resettled his hat. "Because I knew your father," he said simply. "Thomas Brooks ran a clean surveying business for 20 years. He didn't raise a thief." He touched the brim of his hat. "Trail going west starts at the end of this street. Follow it up into the pines. You'll smell the smoke from his cook fire before you see the place." He walked away before she could ask his name. The trail west climbed for 3 hours. Hannah's bag cut into her shoulder, and her boots were not made for this kind of terrain, and the heat was merciless, pressing down through the pine canopy in heavy shafts that found her no matter which way she angled herself. The mountain didn't care that she was tired. It didn't care that she hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. It simply rose, and she climbed it one step at a time, which was the only way anything got done in her experience. She smelled the smoke before she saw the buildings, the way the old man said she would. Then the trees thinned, and she was standing at the edge of a clearing that spread wide and gold in the afternoon light. There were cattle, maybe 60 head that she could see spread across the grass in that slow, deliberate way cattle had, as if they'd decided to be there and intended to take their time about it. There was a barn solid and dark, and a smaller structure that might have been a smokehouse, and a main house, built from logs that had weathered to silver gray, nothing pretty about it. Nothing built for show, just built to last. And there was a man. He was working near the fence line, and he didn't look up when she came out of the trees, which meant either he hadn't heard her, or he was choosing not to acknowledge her, until he decided what he thought. He was taller than average lean in the way of men who did physical work, from before sunrise to after sunset, and his shirt was dark with sweat at the back and shoulders. He drove a fence post with a steady economic rhythm, no wasted motion, no drama, just the work getting done. Hannah walked toward him. She stopped about 10 feet away, because that felt like the appropriate distance from a man who hadn't invited her any closer. "Mr. Walker." He straightened. He turned. She'd expected an old man for some reason. The way the old man in town had described him alone, a long time lost behind him, she'd built a picture in her head of someone worn down by it. But Ethan Walker was maybe 36, 37, with a face that was weathered but not old, and dark eyes that looked at her with the same calm, assessing steadiness with which the mountain itself seemed to regard her not hostile, not welcoming, simply measuring. "Who are you?" he said. Not quite a question, not yet hostile. "Hannah Brooks, I was told you might be looking for a hand." Something moved across his face, not surprise, exactly more like recalibration. He looked at her carpet bag. He looked at her boots, which had about 3 more miles left in them before they gave up entirely. He looked at the bruise on her cheekbone, which she had forgotten to try to hide. "Who told you that?" he said. "An old man in Caldwell. He didn't give me his name." Ethan looked toward the trail she'd come from, as if he could still see it. "Caleb Morrow," he said mostly to himself. He pulled a cloth from his back pocket and wiped his hands and looked at her again. "You work ranches before?" "No, sir. I kept books for the assay office in Millhaven for 3 years. Before that, I worked my father's farm from the time I was 8. She held his gaze because looking away felt like the kind of thing guilty people did. "I know how to work. I know how to follow instruction. I'm asking for a fair wage and a place to sleep, and I'll earn both." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the pines at the edge of the clearing. "I heard about Millhaven," he said. There it was. She didn't let her expression change. "Then you've heard Gerald Holt's version." "I've heard a version." "A version is not the same as the truth." He looked at her for a long moment. He had a way of being still that felt different from the stillness of a man who wasn't thinking. It felt like the stillness of a man who was thinking very carefully, and who had learned that opening his mouth before he'd finished thinking was a good way to say the wrong thing. "What's the truth?" he said. "I kept the books. I found a discrepancy, $800, that had moved from the company accounts in a way that didn't match any transaction I'd recorded. I reported it to the mine manager. 2 weeks later, I was standing in front of a magistrate being charged with embezzlement. She said it flat and clean, no performance in it because she was too tired for performance, and because she'd found that plain truth landed harder anyway. Gerald Holt is the mine manager's brother-in-law. He had friends, money, and a story. I had a clean ledger that had mysteriously gone missing from the office." Ethan said nothing. "I can't prove any of it," she said. "I know how that sounds, but that's the truth and you asked for it." He was quiet again. The cattle shifted somewhere behind her. A bird called once from the tree line and didn't call again. "Bunkhouse is around the back of the barn," Ethan Walker said finally. "There's a cot and a wash basin. Supper's at sundown. We start at first light." He picked up his post driver again. "Wages are fair." He turned back to his fence. Hannah stood there for a moment, not sure she'd heard him correctly. "That's you're giving me the job." "Seems like? You don't know me." "I know what Caleb Morrow thinks of people," he said without turning around. "That's enough for now." The bunkhouse was small and smelled like pine resin and old leather, and she didn't mind either. There was a cot with a wool blanket and a wash basin with a clean cloth folded beside it, and a small window that faced east, which meant she would get the morning light, which she had always loved. She set her bag down and sat on the edge of the cot, and she pressed her hands flat on her knees, and she breathed. She was not going to cry. She had told herself 11 days ago that she was not going to cry, and she had kept that promise, and she intended to keep it. But sitting in that small, clean room on that mountain, with the smell of pines coming through the window, and the sound of the wind in the trees, and the distant low sound of the cattle settling for the afternoon. Something in her chest that had been pulled very tight for a very long time let go just slightly, just slightly. She lay down on the cot without meaning to, and she was asleep in 3 minutes. She woke to the sound of something being set down outside, a bucket maybe, or a piece of equipment. The light through the window had gone amber and low, which meant sunset was close. She was on her feet, and at the wash basin before she was fully awake. Old habit. You didn't sleep past your work in her family's house. You just didn't. When she came around the side of the barn, Ethan was already at the cook fire, which surprised her. The image she'd had of a man who lived alone and did things his own way had included him eating out of a pan whenever he got around to it. Instead, he had a proper fire going, a cast iron pot hung over it, and he was cutting something an onion, she thought, with the kind of efficient practiced motion that suggested he'd done this particular thing 10,000 times. He didn't look up when she appeared. "Beans and salt pork," he said. "There's cornbread from yesterday in the tin on the post there." "I can cook," she said. "If you want, tomorrow." He glanced up briefly. "Tonight you eat." She didn't argue with that. She sat on the bench beside the fire, and she ate when he handed her a bowl, and she ate all of it, and then she ate the cornbread, and she felt like a human being again, which she had not felt in 11 days. Ethan ate across the fire from her. He didn't talk. This didn't seem like rudeness. It seemed like the natural state of a man who had spent a long time in his own company and hadn't felt the lack of conversation. The fire was enough. The pines were enough. After a while, she said, "How long have you been up here alone?" He considered the question as if it deserved actual thought. "Going on 6 years," he said. "That's a long time." "Depends on what you're comparing it to." She looked at the fire. "Your ranch hand, why'd he quit?" "Opportunity in the valley." A pause. "Or so he said." "You don't believe him." "I believe he had his reasons." He set his bowl down. "A man's allowed his reasons." She looked at him across the fire. He was looking at the flames, not at her, and in that light he looked less like a man who'd built walls around himself, and more like a man who'd simply accepted that some things were what they were, and he had made a kind of peace with it. She wondered not for the first time that day why he'd said yes. A man that careful, that measured, that economical. With his words, he wasn't someone who made decisions quickly or carelessly. He'd known about Millhaven. He'd listened to her tell a story with no proof attached to it. And he'd said yes anyway. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Ethan." Ethan. It felt strange to say his name, but he'd offered it, and she used it. "Why'd you take me on?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because Caleb Morrow told you to come," he said finally. "And because a woman who's been walking 3 hours up a mountain in July to ask a stranger for an honest job is telling me something about who she is without saying a word." She didn't know what to do with that, so she didn't do anything. She just looked back at the fire. "Get some sleep," he said, standing and taking his bowl. "Like I said, first light." First light came at what felt like the middle of the night. Ethan was already at the fire when she came out, and there was coffee, black and strong. And she took the cup he held out without a word, because there were no words yet. There was only the pale gray before sunrise, and the cold that came down from the peaks at that hour, even in July, and the smell of pine and wood smoke. He showed her the morning routine in the way he seemed to do everything without wasted motion, without condescension, simply showing. The cattle needed checking. The water troughs needed topping. There was a section of the fence on the north pasture that had been giving trouble, and he needed to ride out to it before the morning was gone. "Can you ride?" he asked when they reached the barn. "Yes." "Good." He saddled 2 horses. He handed her the reins of a gray mare without ceremony, and she took them. They rode out of the clearing into the pasture, and for a while neither of them spoke, and the only sounds were the horses and the wind and the early birds in the trees, and somewhere far below, the sound of water moving over rock. "This land," Hannah said after a while, "all of it yours." 412 acres, he said. "Registered. Paid." A pause. "There's been interest in it." "What kind of interest?" He glanced at her. "The kind with money behind it." "Mining. Timber. A company out of Denver's been buying up mountain parcels." He looked ahead toward the fence line they were approaching. "They've made 2 offers. I've turned them down twice." "And they accepted that—" Something shifted in his jaw, not quite tightened. "So far." She filed that away. There was more to it, she could hear it in those 2 words. The weight of something not said, but she didn't push. It wasn't her business, not yet. Maybe not ever. The fence section was worse than he'd described. 3 posts had shifted, probably from the ground softening in the spring melt and then hardening back unevenly, and the wire had gone slack and in one place had snapped entirely. Hannah tied off her horse and bent to look at the post nearest her. She pressed on it. It gave a full 2 inches. "I'll need to reset these," Ethan said, dismounting behind her. "I can hold the post if you drive it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and pulled the post driver from the supply roll on his saddle. It was hard work. The post had to come out before it could go back in straight, and the ground, despite looking soft, had dried to near iron in the July heat below the first 4 inches. Ethan worked the post out, and Hannah braced it in the new position he indicated, and she held it steady against the impact while he drove it, and her arms ached with it, and she didn't say so. "Left," he said. She adjusted. That's it. 3 more strikes, and the post was solid. She stepped back and rolled her shoulders carefully. "You hold a line steady," he said. Not effusive, just an observation, the way he might note that the sky was clear or the ground was dry. "My father built his own fences," she said. "He didn't have sons." Ethan nodded as if that explained everything, because in his world it probably did. "You didn't have help. You became your own help." That was the simple arithmetic of it. They worked down the fence line for 2 more hours. By the time they turned back toward the ranch, the sun was fully up and the dew had burned off the grass and the cattle had spread themselves across the pasture in that slow, purposeful way they had following the best grazing without any particular hurry. Hannah was tired. Her shoulders hurt. Her boots had rubbed a blister on her left heel that she'd been ignoring for the last hour. She felt better than she had in 11 days. The trouble started on her 3rd day. She'd ridden down to Caldwell with Ethan for supplies he'd needed it anyway, he said, and it was practical for her to come, since she knew what was needed in a kitchen, and he did not, a fact he stated without embarrassment. She'd put together a list the night before, and she was working through it at the mercantile counter while he loaded sacks of feed into the wagon bed outside. She heard the whispers before she could make out words. Then the words clarified. "That's her. The one from Millhaven. What's she doing here? I thought Walker brought her down. Walker." A pause heavy with implication. "What's he doing bringing her kind onto his land?" She kept her eyes on her list. She placed her order with the man behind the counter, who took it down without meeting her eyes and went to fill it. A woman appeared at her elbow. Mid-40s, well-dressed in the particular way of women who use their dress to signal their standing. "Excuse me," the woman said. Hannah looked at her. "I don't know what story you told Ethan Walker," the woman said, keeping her voice low and even. The kind of low and even that was somehow louder than shouting, "But people in this county know what came out of Millhaven. We know what kind of woman gets herself run out of a decent town." Hannah held the woman's gaze. "I know what kind of woman does the running," she said quietly. The woman's eyes sharpened. "You've got some nerve. Afternoon, Mrs. Delaney." Ethan's voice came from the doorway behind her. The woman turned. Something moved across her face. Not embarrassment, she didn't seem capable of that, but a recalculation. "Ethan?" She recovered smoothly. I heard what you were just," he said. He came to the counter and stood beside Hannah, not in front of her, beside her, as a deliberate thing. "Hannah's working on my ranch. That's my business and mine alone." He looked at Mrs. Delaney with the same calm, measuring expression he brought to everything. "I'd be obliged if you'd let her do her shopping in peace." Mrs. Delaney looked between them. Her mouth formed something that wasn't quite a smile. "Of course," she said, and left. Hannah looked at the counter. She heard the door close behind the woman. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Ethan said. He picked up one of the packages the storekeeper had set on the counter. "You ready?" She looked at him. At the set of his jaw, the steadiness of his hands, the complete absence of drama in the way he had just stood beside her against a woman who'd lived in this town 30 years, and who would remember it and who would talk about it. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." They didn't talk on the way back up the mountain. But somewhere in the second hour of the trail, when the pines had closed in again and the town was far below, and the air had changed back to that clean old-growth smell she was already starting to think of as belonging to this place. Ethan spoke. Caleb Morrow was a circuit judge for 15 years, he said, before his knees gave out. She looked at him. He's read more testimony than any man in this county, he continued. Seen more liars, heard more truth. He looked ahead at the trail. When Caleb sends someone to my door, he's already weighed them. Hannah was quiet for a moment. He knew my father. I know. He paused. He told me. She turned to look at him. When did he? Yesterday morning. Rode up while you were still asleep. He said it simply, not as if it were significant, just information. He wanted to make sure I knew what I had. She didn't know what to do with that either. A judge who'd known her father riding 3 hours up a mountain before dawn to vouch for her to a stranger who'd already given her the job. The mountain, she was starting to think, had its own kind of logic. Different from the logic of towns. The ranch came into view through the thinning trees, and the cattle were where they'd left them, and the smoke from the cook fire was a thin, straight line against the sky, and it looked like the kind of thing she had not let herself want in a very long time. Something solid. Something that stayed. She was not going to let herself think like that yet. She had been here 3 days. She had a blistered heel and sore shoulders and a past that Gerald Holt had poisoned against her in every direction she could reach. But the mountain held her anyway without asking her permission. And for right now, just for right now, that was enough. The morning she burned the biscuits was the morning everything shifted. Not dramatically. Not in the way that you'd notice if you were watching from the outside. But Hannah Brooks had learned to pay attention to small things, because in her experience, the small things were the ones that mattered. The small things were what everything else was built on. She had been at the ranch 11 days by then. 11 days since she'd walked out of the tree line with a blister on her heel and a carpet bag that was too heavy, and a name that Gerald Holt had spent considerable money and effort turning into something people flinched away from. 11 days of first light and fence posts and cattle, and a man who communicated primarily through the economy of what he didn't say. She burned the biscuits because she was distracted, and she was distracted because she had been awake since 3 in the morning listening to something move through the dark at the edge of the tree line. Something large, something deliberate, something that wasn't wind. She'd lain still on her cot with her hand on the pocket knife she kept under her pillow, and she'd listened, and whatever it was had moved along the northern edge of the clearing and gone still, and then moved again. And then there had been a sound from the cattle that wasn't quite alarm, but was close to it, a low unrest, and then nothing. Just the dark in the pines and the distant sound of the creek. So when she stood at the cook fire in the gray before sunrise, and the smell hit her, she pulled the biscuit pan off a full 3 minutes too late. She was staring at them, calculating how salvageable they were when Ethan came out of the barn. He looked at the pan. He looked at her. He said nothing. Something was in the tree line last night, she said. North side. I heard it maybe 2 hours past midnight. That got his attention in a different way than the biscuits had. How long did it stay? Maybe 20 minutes. It came along the fence line from the east and went still somewhere near the big pine at the corner. She paused. It wasn't a deer. No, he said. It wouldn't be. He took a biscuit from the pan, looked at the bottom of it, bit into it anyway. Cat, he said. Mountain lion. She comes through every few weeks. Hasn't taken a calf in 2 years, but she looks. You've seen her. Once. Last summer. He finished the biscuit without complaint. She's not the problem. Hannah looked at him. What's the problem? He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was deciding how much to say. Men have been cutting the wire on the south pasture, he said. 3 times in the last month, before you got here. He picked up his coffee cup. Last time they left a note. What kind of note? The kind that tells you what they're willing to pay, and suggests that the offer won't last. She let that settle. The Denver Timber Company. Harlan Briggs, he said. He's their man in this county, buys what he can, takes what he can't buy. He said it without heat, just flat fact. He's been working his way up the mountain range all spring. I'm one of 3 holdouts. And the other 2 sold, one of them last week. He set his cup down. Old man Garrity, 83 years old. He didn't want to sell, but he woke up one morning and his barn had burned. The word burned sat between them with a particular weight, given what she knew about Ethan's family and what fire had already taken from him. She didn't say anything about that. She just looked at the pan of blackened biscuits and thought about what it meant that someone had already started applying pressure, and that she had been hearing things move in the dark along his fence line. "How many men does Briggs run?" she asked. Ethan looked at her with something new in his expression, a slight recalibration, the same thing she'd seen on her first day, like he was revising some estimate upward. "3 that I've seen," he said. "Maybe more." "And you've been doing this alone?" "Until 11 days ago." She picked up her coffee cup. "Then let's not waste the morning." She said it the same way he said most things, flat and plain, no drama in it. And something at the corner of his mouth shifted almost imperceptibly, not a smile, not quite, but the shadow of one. They left the burned biscuits where they were and went to work. The south pasture was a 40-minute ride, and when they reached the fence line, she saw immediately what he meant. The wire had been repaired. Ethan had clearly done it himself more than once, but whoever was cutting it wasn't doing it randomly. They were cutting it in the same 3 spots, creating a corridor, a path wide enough for cattle to drift through and onto the open mountain land below, where they could be collected by men who could claim they'd found strays. "They're not just pressuring you," she said. "They're bleeding you, slow." "That's my read." She crouched by the nearest post and looked at the ground around it. The grass was flattened in a pattern that was wrong for wind or cattle. "2 men," she said. "Maybe last Tuesday, given how the grass has grown back at the edges." He crouched beside her and looked where she was looking. "How do you know that?" "My father surveyed land," she said. "I spent half my childhood reading ground." She stood. "Mr. Walker." "Ethan." "Ethan." She looked down the fence line. "If they come back and cut it a 4th time, you'll lose that section of pasture for the season. The cattle will drift, and you won't find all of them before someone else does." "I know. So we need to be here when they come." He looked at her steadily. "That's not your fight." She held his gaze. "I'm working your ranch," she said. "Your land is my business. Your cattle are my business. Whoever's cutting this wire is making it my business whether they mean to or not." He held her gaze for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass around them. "All right," he said. They set the watch that night. Ethan took the first half, Hannah the second, and she relieved him at 2 in the morning with coffee in a tin pot wrapped in cloth to keep it warm, and he handed off without a word and went back to the house, and she sat in the dark at the south fence line with the moon up and the pines black against the sky and the cattle quiet in the pasture behind her. Nothing came. They rotated the watch for 3 nights, and nothing came. And on the 4th morning, Hannah woke to find a note tucked under the door of her bunkhouse. She stared at it for a moment before she picked it up. It was folded once, no envelope, the handwriting blocky and deliberate. It said, "This isn't your trouble. Go back where you came from." She stood in her doorway in the early morning with that piece of paper in her hand, and she thought about 11 days ago, and the water trough in Caldwell, and the dry biscuit she'd eaten in halves, and the 7 doors that had closed in her face. She thought about Gerald Holt standing up in that room with his calm, moneyed certainty, and explaining to a magistrate how the woman who'd uncovered his theft was in fact the thief. She folded the paper back up, and she went to find Ethan. He was in the barn when she found him working on a piece of harness that had cracked. She held out the paper without preamble. He read it. His jaw tightened just slightly, just the one visible tell he had for things that made him angry. "When did you find it?" "This morning, under my door." He looked at it again, then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. "They were on the property last night. At least long enough to get to the bunkhouse door, which means they know the layout." He set the harness down. "They've been watching." The word watching moved through her differently than it might have a month ago. A month ago, she hadn't known what it felt like to have men watching, to have the particular weight of being surveilled by people who meant you harm. She knew now. She'd learned it in Millhaven before she'd learned anything else about how things went wrong. "They want me gone," she said. "They think if I'm gone, you'll be easier to pressure." Ethan looked at her. "Are you? Am I what?" "Going." She looked back at him. "No." He nodded once. "Then we keep the watch." What she didn't tell him was that the note had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. Not because she was afraid, or not only because she was afraid, but because it meant that whoever Harlan Briggs had working for him had decided she was enough of a variable to be worth addressing directly. She had been on this mountain 11 days. She had become enough of a fixture here, enough of a factor that someone had felt the need to tell her to leave. That meant she was mattering, and mattering in her experience was when things got dangerous. She thought about this while she was checking the north pasture fence that afternoon, and she thought about it while she cooked supper, and she was still thinking about it when a rider came through the tree line at the east end of the clearing, at a pace that said the news was urgent. She recognized him. She'd seen him once in Caldwell, a young man, maybe 19, who worked at the livery. He pulled up hard outside the barn and shouted for Ethan, and Ethan came out of the barn with the particular economy of movement that said he'd been listening for something like this. "Mr. Walker, it's Garrity." Ethan went still. "What happened?" "They found him this morning, in the ravine off the North Trail." The young man's horse was still dancing under him, picking up his agitation. "He's alive. Doc Hemmings got him. But his leg's broke, and he ain't right in the head, Mr. Walker. He's saying things, saying they pushed him." Hannah watched Ethan's face. She watched the stillness in it, the kind of stillness that was very different from his usual measured quiet. This was the stillness of a man controlling something large and unwilling to be contained. "Saying who pushed him," Ethan said. The young man glanced at Hannah, then back. "He's saying 2 of Briggs's men followed him on the trail." A pause. "Nobody in town's willing to take that to Sheriff Klein." "Why not?" "Because Briggs has—" The young man stopped. He looked at his hands on the reins. "Because people are scared, sir." Ethan looked at the ground for a moment, then he looked up. "Tell Doc Hemming I'll be in tomorrow." He reached into his pocket and came out with something and tossed it up to the young man, a coin, 2 coins. Hannah couldn't see how many. "You ride straight back and you don't stop." The young man turned his horse and went back through the trees the way he'd come. Ethan stood in the clearing for a moment without moving. "An 83-year-old man," Hannah said because she didn't know what else to say. "He wouldn't sell," Ethan said, "even after the barn. So we don't know what they did," he said. But his voice said he knew perfectly well. She watched him stand there with his hands open at his sides, and she understood something about him in that moment that she hadn't understood before, not from the fence line, or the supplies run, or the 3 nights of the watch. She understood that whatever had happened to his foster family in that fire, whatever he'd been carrying up this mountain for the past 6 years, it had not made him cold. It had made him careful. Those were different things entirely. Careful men still felt things. They just didn't spend those feelings until they knew exactly where the spending would count. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He looked at her. "What I should have done a month ago," he said. "I'm going to document everything." He started toward the house. Every cut wire, every date, every track. Every time Briggs's men have been on this land. She followed him. "I can help with that." He stopped and looked back at her. "I kept books for 3 years, she said. "I know how to build a record that holds up." She met his gaze. "That's what Gerald Holt didn't count on. He thought he could make the ledger disappear. He didn't count on the fact that I'd memorized it." She paused. "I don't forget numbers. I don't forget dates. And I have a very good memory for exactly the kind of detail that matters in a legal proceeding." He looked at her for a long moment. In the fading afternoon light, he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's work, and everything to do with 6 years of being alone on this mountain fighting something that didn't care about being fair. "You'd do that," he said, not a question, genuinely trying to understand. "I'd do that," she said. He turned back toward the house. "Then come inside," he said. I'll make coffee. They worked by lamplight until past 10 o'clock. Hannah took the paper. He found a worn ledger he'd been using to track cattle numbers and supply costs, and she restructured it, creating a new section at the back, and she began writing down everything he could remember. Every date the wire had been cut, every track she had read, the note under her bunkhouse door, the young man's account of Garrity in the ravine. She wrote it clean and precise, the way she had always written, with dates on the left margin and details right aligned in a way that made the pattern visible at a glance. Ethan sat across the table from her, and he talked, and watching him talk, she understood that this was not something that came easily to him. This accounting of things that had been done to him. This naming of injury in plain language. He was a man who processed the world through action, through the physical language of work. Putting it into words, building it into a record, felt like a different kind of effort. But he did it. He went back 6 weeks, and he did it carefully, and he didn't skip the parts that were uncomfortable or that made him sound like he'd waited too long. When they were done, she set the pen down and looked at what they'd built. "This is a pattern," she said. "Anyone looking at this can see it's a pattern. 3 incidents in one location, escalating from property damage to possible assault." She looked at him across the table. "This is enough to take to a territorial land office. Klein won't act on it." "I'm not talking about Klein." She held his gaze. "Caleb Morrow said he was a circuit judge for 15 years. Who does a circuit judge know?" Something shifted behind his eyes. Not surprise, more like a door opening that he'd thought was locked. "He knows Judge Aldous Pemberton," he said slowly. "They came up together. Pemberton's got jurisdiction over territorial land disputes in this district." "Then that's where this goes," she said. He looked at her. He looked at the ledger. He looked back at her. "You're good at this," he said. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." It wasn't arrogance. It was just the truth stated the way he stated things, plainly, without decoration. And something in him seemed to recognize, that seemed to settle toward it the way you settle toward solid ground after uncertain footing. "I'll ride to Caleb's tomorrow after I check on Garrity," he said. "I'll hold the watch on the south pasture while you're gone," she said. He opened his mouth, closed it. She could see him calculating the objection and discarding it because the objection was that it wasn't safe, and they both knew perfectly well that it wasn't safe, and she was going to do it anyway. "Take the rifle," he said. "Not the Winchester. The Remington in the barn left side of the tack room. It's got more range." "All right." He stood. He picked up the lamp. At the door of the main house, he stopped his back to her, one hand on the doorframe. "Hannah," he said. She looked up from gathering her things. "Thank you," he said. Quiet. Unornamented. The way he said everything important. She didn't say "you're welcome" because that felt too small. She just nodded and went out into the dark toward the bunkhouse, with the cricket sound rising up from the grass and the stars very clear overhead, and something in her chest that had been pulled tight for a long time, letting go another fraction, just a fraction, but real. He was gone before first light. She found the note he'd left on the cook-fire stone, just a few words in his spare handwriting, telling her the cattle on the east pasture needed moving to the north, grazing before midday, and that there were eggs in the coop she'd been forgetting to collect. That last part was so like him, so perfectly unself-consciously practical in the middle of everything else, that she stood there in the half-dark with that small square of paper, and she felt something warm move through her that she immediately and firmly refused to name. She collected the eggs. She moved the cattle. She took the Remington from the tack room and propped it within arm's reach of the fence post where she'd decided to position herself, and she watched the south pasture through the long, hot hours of the afternoon. Nobody came. But at 3 o'clock, riding back across the upper pasture toward the barn, she found the cattle. Or rather, she found where 23 of the cattle weren't. The gap in the north fence wasn't where they'd been watching. It was 40 yards east of the reinforced section, a stretch she and Ethan had both checked and judged sound. The wire had been cut clean, not torn, not weakened by repeated movement. Cut. With tools in the night while they'd been sitting in the main house building their ledger and thinking they were being careful. 23 head of cattle. Gone through a gap in a fence they hadn't thought to watch because it had seemed fine. She sat her horse at the edge of that gap, and she looked at the ground on the other side, and she read it the way her father had taught her, and she understood immediately that this wasn't random opportunism. This was the response to the ledger, to the documenting, to the decision to take things to a territorial authority. Somebody had been watching the house last night. They'd been inside building a case, and Harlan Briggs's men had been outside dismantling the reason for it. She turned the horse and rode hard for the house. She wrote it down first before she did anything else. Date, time, location, the angle of the cut wire, the track count, and direction of travel from the gap. She wrote it the way she would have written a discrepancy in the assay office ledger, clean and precise and without editorial, because emotion and documentation gave the other side room to argue. Facts didn't argue back. Then she saddled back up and went to find the cattle. She followed the tracks south and east for 2 hours further down the mountain than she'd ridden before, into a section where the pines gave way to scrub brush and the terrain folded into dry gullies that could hide a surprising amount of livestock. She found the cattle in the third gully. She checked 21 of the 23 bunched and unhappy in the afternoon heat, held in place by a natural rock formation on 3 sides. The other 2 were gone. She got the 21 moving, and she pushed them back up the mountain, the way you pushed cattle when you were one person doing a 3-person job, wide, patient, constant. It took until sundown. By the time she pushed the last of them through the gate on the north pasture and wired it shut behind her with the spare coil from the saddlebag, her arms felt like wet rope, and her horse was blowing hard, and the stars were coming out. Ethan rode in 20 minutes later. He saw the cattle first. Then he saw her sitting on the fence post with the Remington across her knees and her hat off and her hair falling loose in a way she hadn't bothered to fix. He dismounted and walked to the fence. "What happened?" he said. "They cut the north fence last night while we were inside," she said. "Ran 23 head through. I found 21 in a gully 2 hours south." She paused. "I wrote it all down before I went after them." He stood very still, looking at the cattle, looking at her, looking at the wired gate. 2 hours south," he said, "alone. I had the Remington." A long pause. "You could have waited," he said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. "I could have," she agreed. "And in the time I waited, the tracks would have shifted and someone might have moved them further." She held his gaze. "I made a judgment call." He looked at her for a long moment. The evening had gone purple and cool around them. Somewhere in the pasture, one of the recovered cattle lowed once deep and low. "Caleb's writing to Pemberton," he said finally, letting the other thing go. "He thinks we can get a territorial investigator out here within 2 weeks if the documentation is strong enough." "It's strong enough," she said. "2 of the cattle are gone." "Yes. That's money. I know." She met his gaze. "We'll get it back another way. Through the investigation, maybe. Document the loss tonight while the date is clean." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he reached up and took the Remington from across her knees and held out his other hand. She took it. He helped her down from the fence post, and she was more tired than she'd admitted because she came down harder than she intended, and he caught her weight for a moment. One hand holding hers, one catching her elbow, and they were closer together than they'd been since the first day. And she felt his steadiness like something physical, like the fence post itself, something that held. She stepped back. He let go. "Come eat something," he said. "Then we document." They went to the house in the last of the evening light, and neither of them said the thing that was quietly becoming true between them with every day that passed, and every fence they fixed, and every problem they faced together on this mountain. Because they were both people who had learned the cost of saying things too soon, and so they didn't say it. But it was there. Between the lamp and the ledger, and the 2 tin cups, and the window that faced west, and the last of the summer light going out over the peaks, it was quietly, stubbornly, irrevocably there. And Harlan Briggs's men, for all their wire cutters, and their threatening notes, and their missing cattle, hadn't taken that. Not yet. The letter from Judge Aldous Pemberton arrived on a Thursday 12 days after Caleb Morrow had put his own letter on the eastbound stage. Hannah knew it was important before Ethan even opened it because of the way he stood holding it, that particular stillness of his that meant something was being weighed. She didn't rush him. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table near his hand and sat down and waited. He opened it. He read it twice. She could tell by the way his eyes moved, one pass quick, one pass slow and careful. Then he set it on the table and pushed it toward her. She read it. Pemberton wrote in the clipped, precise language of a man who had spent decades reducing complicated situations to actionable sentences. He acknowledged Caleb's account. He acknowledged the documentation. He said a territorial investigator by the name of Cole Beaumont would be arriving in Caldwell within 10 days to assess the land dispute claims and examine evidence of criminal interference with registered property. He said that any additional documentation gathered before Beaumont's arrival should be organized and ready for review. He said one other thing at the bottom in a different tone, a personal note that felt like it had been added after the official language was done. It said, "Caleb tells me there's a woman involved in building this record. Tell her I'd like to see her accounting methods. A clean ledger at the right moment has won more cases than a good lawyer." Hannah set the letter down. 10 days, she said. 10 days, Ethan confirmed. She looked at the ledger on the shelf. Their ledger, the one they'd been building together for nearly 2 weeks now. Every cut wire and every track and every date rendered in her precise columns with his recollections filling in the gaps. "We need more," she said. "The 2 missing cattle, I need their tag numbers, whatever you have on the original stock registration." "I've got the registration papers from when I filed the land claim," he said. "Cattle were inventoried at that point. Then we cross-reference what's missing against the original inventory, and we put a dollar value on every incident." She was already thinking ahead, the way she'd thought ahead over the assay office ledger when she'd first started to see the shape of what Gerald Holt had been doing. Beaumont needs to see a number. Not just property damage, a specific documented financial loss. That's what moves a territorial investigator. "You know a lot about how these things work," Ethan said, not suspicious, genuinely curious. "I know what it looks like when a record doesn't hold up," she said. "I watched mine fall apart in Millhaven because Holt had the original and I only had my memory." She smoothed her hand flat on the table. "This time the original stays with us." He nodded. He went to get the registration papers. They spent the morning on it. By the time the sun had moved past noon, they had a complete accounting. A financial record of losses and damages that started 6 weeks before Hannah had arrived and ran clean through to the present day, with every number sourced to a document and every document referenced in the margin. It was the best piece of bookkeeping Hannah had ever done, and she knew it not with pride exactly, but with the particular satisfaction of work that was exactly as good as it needed to be. She was capping the ink when Ethan said, "Briggs is going to know about Pemberton's investigator." She looked up. "Word moves fast in this county," he said. He was standing at the window looking out. "Same way it moved about you. If Beaumont's been dispatched, someone in the land office or the stage office or the hotel where Beaumont's going to stay will have mentioned it. Which means Briggs has 10 days to make this look different than it is," she said, "or to make it worse." He turned from the window. "If he moves fast enough, if he takes more cattle, or does more damage before Beaumont arrives, he can argue that the situation on this land is too unstable for a single owner to manage." He paused. "There's a provision in territorial land law that lets the county take over management of disputed property in cases of, they call it, demonstrated insolvency of stewardship." Hannah stared at him. "That's what he's been doing. Not just pressuring you to sell, building a case that you can't manage the land." "I think so." "The 2 missing cattle, the cut fences, the note under my door that was meant to push me out, and if I'd gone you'd have been alone up here, and more incidents would have happened, and the pattern would look like a man who couldn't keep his own ranch together." "That's my read," he said. She thought about it. "Then the 10 days work against us, as much as they work for us." "Unless we make them work differently." She looked at him. He was watching her with that measuring expression, the one she'd come to understand, meant he'd already thought something through part way, and was now thinking it through the rest of the way with her. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I'm thinking Briggs doesn't know what we've already built," he said. "He knows I've been keeping notes, maybe. He knows you've been here. He does not know that we've got a complete financial record sourced and dated that traces every incident back to his men." He moved to the table and put his hand flat on the ledger. "So, when he moves in the next 10 days, and he will move, we let him add to the record instead of trying to stop him. Let him cut the wire. Let him cut the wire. Document it the same night. Get Caleb to witness the documentation and sign it." He paused. "Briggs thinks he's building a case against us. We let him think that." Hannah looked at the ledger. She looked at Ethan. "That's a risk," she said. "If he takes more cattle—" "I know. Or if he escalates beyond property damage." "I know that too." She held his gaze. "Then we watch each other's backs for 10 days. Something settled in his expression. "Yes," he said. "That's what we do." She nodded once. "All right." What neither of them said, what neither of them was ready to say, was that this was not what ranch hands did for their employers. You didn't offer to watch a man's back through 10 days of potential escalation because it was part of the wage agreement. You did it because somewhere in 23 days of first light and fence posts and ledgers and cattle drives and a note under a bunkhouse door and a moment at a fence post in the evening, when he'd caught her weight and held it, something had become something else. She didn't name it. He didn't name it. They both knew better than to name things that weren't ready yet. They went back to work. The first 3 days were quiet, in the way that loud things are quiet right before they stop being quiet. Hannah kept the watch patterns varied so that no one observing from the tree line could predict where she'd be or when. Ethan rode the full fence perimeter every morning at a different hour. They checked in with each other twice a day, once mid-morning when he came back from the east pasture, and once at sundown at the cook fire, and the check-ins were brief and practical and efficient, and also in the particular language of two people who communicated mostly in what they didn't say something else entirely. On the 4th day, Caleb Morrow rode up. He came in the late afternoon, moving more easily than a man his age on a horse had any right to. And he accepted coffee and sat at the table and looked at the ledger Hannah put in front of him with the eyes of a man who had read evidence for 15 years and knew immediately what he was looking at. "This is good work," he said. He looked at Hannah. "This is very good work." "The sourcing is clean?" she asked. "Cleaner than half the accounting I reviewed from the county clerk's office." He turned a page. "Every number's documented, every date specific." He tapped one entry. "This one, the cut wire on the north fence. You've got the tool mark description." "The cut edge was too clean for standard wire cutters," she said. "The gauge suggested fencing pliers modified for heavier wire. That's a specific tool that would need to be purchased or made." Caleb looked at Ethan. Ethan looked slightly surprised. "I didn't know that part," he said to Hannah. "I wrote it in the margin," she said. "You didn't ask." Caleb made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had been less dignified. "Pemberton is going to like you," he said. "I'll sign as witness today, and take a copy back with me tonight." He straightened. "I also have news. Beaumont arrived in Caldwell 2 days early." Hannah set her cup down. "He's at the Caldwell Inn," Caleb continued. "He's been asking questions, quietly, but not so quietly that Briggs doesn't know he's there." A pause. "Briggs has been in town every day this week." "What's he doing?" Ethan said. "Talking," Caleb said. "Visiting people, having meals with Sheriff Klein." His expression said clearly what he thought of that. "And he had a meeting yesterday with Mrs. Delaney." Hannah felt something cold move through her. "What kind of meeting?" she said. Caleb looked at her steadily. The kind where a man with money talks to a woman who has influence in town, and what comes out of the meeting is that a story starts moving through Caldwell about a woman from Mill Haven who is not what she seems. The cold settled. She'd been waiting for this. She'd known somewhere underneath the daily work and the ledger and the watch rotations that Holt's poison would find its way here eventually. Word moved fast in this county. Caleb had told her that on the first day. "What story?" she said. "That you weren't just accused of embezzlement." Caleb said not unkindly. "That there's a question about what exactly your relationship is with Ethan Walker. That a respectable man has been deceived by a woman with a history of deception." He paused. "That the land dispute on this ranch is not what it appears to be and may involve collusion." The room was very quiet. Ethan's expression had not changed. He was looking at Caleb with the same measured attention he brought to everything but Hannah, who had spent 23 days learning the specific language of his silences, could hear the anger in this one. "Briggs fed that to her," Ethan said. "Not a question. In exchange for her repeating it, I'd imagine." Caleb folded his hands on the table. "Mrs. Delaney is a woman who values her standing in this community, and who has a certain perspective on women who arrive under difficult circumstances and find shelter on the ranches of unmarried men." Hannah stood up. Both men looked at her. "I'm going to town tomorrow," she said. "I'd like to speak to Mr. Beaumont directly." "Hannah," Ethan started. "He's there to do an investigation," she said. "The best thing a subject of false narrative can do is get ahead of the narrative. If Briggs is already talking to him through Mrs. Delaney, then Beaumont has heard one version." She looked at Ethan. "He should hear another one, from me, with the ledger." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "I'll come with you." "I know," she said, "but I'd like to speak to him first, alone." Another long moment. "All right," he said. Caleb was watching them both with the expression of a man who had seen a great many things in his life and was currently watching something that he recognized and appreciated. "I'll send word ahead to Beaumont tonight," he said. "He'll see you." She thanked him and went to the bunkhouse, and she sat on the edge of the cot in the dark with the pocket knife in her hand. Not because she needed it, just because it was there. Just because holding something solid helped when the ground was shifting, and she thought about Gerald Holt, and she thought about Harlan Briggs, and she thought about Mrs. Delaney's cool, deliberate voice in the mercantile, and she understood that the thing she was actually afraid of was not any of those people individually. She was afraid of the pattern they collectively represented. The pattern of men with money and women with social currency conspiring to reduce a thing that was true to something that could be argued against. She had watched that pattern work in Millhaven. She had been destroyed by it once already. She was not going to let it work twice. She opened the ledger she'd brought with her, her personal copy, the one she'd made for exactly this kind of emergency, and she read through it once from the beginning, the way she had once read through the assay office ledger. The night before, everything fell apart, committing every number and every date and every tool mark description to a place in her memory where it couldn't be taken from her. She was not going to walk into Cole Beaumont's office with only her word, but she was also not going to walk in without it. The trouble started before she got to town. She and Ethan rode down the mountain the next morning in the early cool, before the full heat of the day hit, and they were an hour out when they came around a bend in the trail and found two men blocking it. Not blocking it exactly, they were stopped, ostensibly resting their horses at the side of the trail. But the positioning was wrong. Too deliberate. Too perfectly timed. Hannah felt Ethan shift in his saddle beside her. She felt the quality of his attention change. The two men looked up as they approached. One was broad-shouldered and sun-darkened with a kind of studied ease that was its own kind of warning. The other was younger, thinner, and he was watching Ethan specifically in the way you watched someone when you'd been told to watch them. "Walker," the broad-shouldered man said. "Pleasant enough. Didn't expect to see you heading down today." "Didn't expect to see you on my access trail," Ethan said. "This is a county trail." "My access trail runs along the county trail for half a mile. You're sitting on the overlap." He kept his horse moving at the same steady pace, not stopping, not accelerating. "Morning." The man moved his horse slightly to close the gap. "Mr. Briggs would like a word with you," he said. "At your convenience." "I'm not available at my convenience," Ethan said. "Move your horse." A pause, the kind of pause that wanted to be something more. "That's a real unfriendly way to talk," the man said. He glanced at Hannah. "Especially when you got company." Hannah held the man's gaze. She didn't say anything. She kept her hands visible and her expression level, and she let him see that she was not afraid of him, even though she was somewhat afraid of him. "Last time I'll say it," Ethan said. His voice hadn't changed in pitch or volume, but it had changed in texture, gone to something that had no give in it at all. "Move your horse." The younger one looked at the older one. Some communication passed between them. The older one moved his horse. They rode through. Hannah didn't look back. She could feel the two men watching them go, and she kept her spine straight and her eyes forward and her hands steady on the reins. When they were around the next bend and out of sight, she said, "They'll send word ahead that we're coming." "Yes," Ethan said. "Which means Briggs will know we're going to see Beaumont before we get there." "Yes." "Does that change what we do?" He looked at her sideways. "Does it change what you want to do?" "No," she said. "Then it doesn't change what we do." Caldwell was busy for a midweek morning. The kind of busy that felt slightly off too many people with reasons to be on the main street that weren't quite convincing. Hannah recognized some faces from her first day in town. She recognized Mrs. Delaney coming out of the post office and stopping at the sight of her. Caleb Morrow was waiting outside the Caldwell Inn. He fell into step beside them as they dismounted. "Beaumont's expecting you," he said quietly. "I should tell you Briggs came to see him last night, spent an hour with him." Hannah looked at Caleb. "What was the outcome?" "Beaumont's a professional," Caleb said. "He didn't tip his hand." A pause. But Briggs left smiling. She absorbed that. "All right." Ethan touched her arm just briefly, just his hand on her forearm for a second. "You said you wanted to go in first." "Yes." "Then go," he said. "I'll be right here." She took the ledger from her saddlebag, and she went in. Cole Beaumont was not what she'd expected. She'd built a mental image of a territorial investigator as someone formal and armored in official authority. The man sitting at the table in the inn's small meeting room was compact and watchful, and dressed practically, and he looked up at her with eyes that had evaluated a great many things, in a great many places, and arrived at their conclusions without announcement. "Miss Brooks," he said, "sit down." She sat. She put the ledger on the table. "Mr. Beaumont," she said, "I've been told that Harlan Briggs spent an hour with you last night. I don't know what he said, but I can tell you what he said in Millhaven 2 years ago, and I can show you how closely it resembles what he's saying now." She opened the ledger. "I'd like to start with the numbers if that's all right with you. People can argue about interpretation. They have a harder time arguing with documented dates and physical evidence." Beaumont looked at the ledger. He looked at her. "Go ahead," he said. She talked for 40 minutes. She walked him through every entry, every sourced number, every toolmark description, every date, cross-referenced against cattle count records and fence repair receipts. She told him about the note under her bunkhouse door and showed him the copy she'd made of it before giving the original to Ethan. She told him about Old Man Garrity in the ravine and gave him the young livery hand's name as a potential witness. She told him about the 2 men on the trail this morning and described them and gave him the time and the location. And then she told him about Millhaven. Not as a confession and not as a defense, but as a data point. Here is a pattern. Here is where it appeared before. Here is the specific mechanism by which a man with money and connections corrupts a record and substitutes a lie for a truth. And here is what it looks like when it starts happening again. Beaumont did not interrupt her once. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and he looked at the ledger for a long moment. "The tool mark description on the north fence entry," he said. "Modified fencing pliers. How do you know that?" "My father was a surveyor. I've been reading ground and reading physical evidence my whole life. She held his gaze. If you have a man who can verify tool marks, I can take him to the fence section and show him the cut ends. They'll still be readable. I do have such a man, Beaumont said. He closed the ledger and pushed it back toward her. Keep this. I'll want it again, but not yet. He stood. I'd like to speak to Mr. Walker now. She went to the door and opened it, and Ethan was there exactly where he'd said he'd be. He looked at her face reading it, the way he read ground, the way she'd come to understand he read everything that mattered. All right, he asked quietly. All right, she said. He went in. She sat in the chair outside the door, and she held the ledger on her lap, and she breathed. Caleb lowered himself into the chair beside her. Well, he said. He listened, she said. He's careful. I don't know yet which way he's thinking. He's thinking the right way, Caleb said with the confidence of a man who'd watched enough people think to know what it looked like. That's all you can ask. Briggs is going to move tonight, she said. Caleb was quiet. He knows we're here. He knows we went to Beaumont. She looked at her hands on the ledger. Whatever he was planning to do in the next 10 days, he's going to compress it. Try to do something that changes the situation on the ground before Beaumont can get up to the ranch. What kind of something? She thought about the barn that had burned on Garrity's land. She thought about the 2 men on the trail. She thought about a man who had smiled after an hour with a territorial investigator, and whether that smile was confidence or calculation. I don't know, she said. That's what worries me. Ethan came out 20 minutes later. He didn't say anything about the meeting, not in the inn hallway, not outside on the street. He retrieved the horses. He looked at Hannah. We need to get back, he said. I know. They made faster time going up than coming down, urgency added to it, something unspoken pushing the pace. The 2 men from the morning weren't on the trail. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. An hour from the ranch, Hannah smelled it. Smoke. She pulled up, and Ethan pulled up beside her, and they both sat their horses, and she looked at his face, and his face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. A specific kind of still, that was not measured calm, but the controlled response to something that reached back further than this day, further than Harlan Briggs, all the way back to a night 6 years ago when he'd come home and found the people he loved had been taken by fire. Ethan. He was already moving. She pushed the gray mare hard to keep up with him, and they came through the tree line into the clearing, and the barn was on fire. Not the house. The barn. The fire had a head start. The roof was already going. The dry summer timber taking it fast, but the house was still standing, and the cattle in the near pasture had pushed to the far fence and were bunched and frantic but contained. Ethan was off his horse before it fully stopped. The water barrels, he shouted. West side of the house, there are 3 barrels. Get them to the east wall of the barn. Slow it down. She was already moving. She didn't think. She ran to the west side of the house and found the barrels full, thankfully filled 2 days ago, and she got the first one rolling, and it was heavy, and the ground was uneven, and it took everything she had, and she got it to the east wall and got the hatch open, and the water hit the wall and turned to steam. She went back for the second barrel. Ethan was at the barn door. He'd gotten the side door open, not the main doors. The side door, and he was pulling equipment out. Harnesses, tools, the supply rolls. He moved fast and deliberate, and she could see him not looking at the roof, making himself not look at the roof, keeping his eyes on what he could save. She got the second barrel to the east wall. The roof came down on the north end. Ethan, get back. He was already clear. He'd read it a second before it fell. She didn't know how some calculation she couldn't follow, and he'd stepped back, and the timber hit the ground 10 feet from where he'd been standing. He stood looking at the fire. She came and stood beside him. They had slowed it enough that the house hadn't caught. The east wall was wet and darkened but standing. The barn was going to be a total loss. She looked at his face. He was watching it with the most open expression she'd ever seen on him. Not the controlled stillness, not the measured quiet, but something raw and old that had nothing to do with boards and timber. "I know," she said softly. Because she didn't know exactly what she was saying, she knew it was the fire that had taken his family. She knew this reached back into something that she had no map for. But she said it anyway, because sometimes that's what you said. Not because you had the specific right words, but because silence was too much distance. He didn't say anything. But after a moment, without taking his eyes from the fire, he reached out and found her hand. She held on. They stood there while the barn finished burning, and it was the most complete silence Hannah Brooks had experienced in a very long time. Not empty, not cold, but the kind of silence that only happens between people who have gotten in the way of people who communicate mostly through action very close. He let go after a while. He didn't apologize for it or make a thing of it. He just let go and said, "I need to check the cattle." And she said, "I'll start writing up what we saw when we came back through the tree line." And they separated and did what needed doing. But Hannah, writing in the ledger by lamplight an hour later with the smell of smoke still in her hair and her hand still carrying the shape of his. Hannah understood that something had shifted on this mountain tonight that had nothing to do with Harlan Briggs and everything to do with two people who had both lost something irreplaceable and had somehow, without planning it, found their way to the same side of the same fire. Beaumont arrived at the ranch the next morning before 7 with a man who looked at fence wire the way Hannah looked at numbers, and they spent 3 hours on the north fence section and came back to the main house with an expression on Beaumont's face that was the closest thing to satisfaction she'd seen from him. "Modified fencing pliers," his man said to no one in particular, consistent with 3 separate incidents. Beaumont looked at Hannah. "Your description was accurate." "Yes," she said. He looked at the burned barn. He looked at the ledger entry she'd made the night before, time-stamped and specific with the wind direction and the advancement of the fire and the estimated time it had been burning when they arrived. He said, "I'm going to need to speak to Sheriff Klein." "Klein won't act against Briggs," Ethan said. "No," Beaumont agreed. "But I'm not asking him to act. I'm informing him that I am." He looked at Ethan steadily. "This is what I'm here for, Mr. Walker. This is exactly what I'm here for." And for the first time in the weeks since Harlan Briggs had begun dismantling this ranch, one wire cut at a time, one threatening note at a time, one burned building at a time, Hannah Brooks felt something shift in the weight of things, some incremental, careful, hard-won tipping. Not victory, not yet, but the beginning of it. Beaumont left the ranch that morning with the fence wire samples wrapped in cloth and the ledger copy tucked under his arm, and the particular expression of a man who had stopped gathering information and started forming conclusions. Hannah watched him ride back down the mountain trail, and she felt for the first time in a long time like the ground under her feet was something she could trust. She should have known better than to trust that feeling. The shift came 4 days later, and it came from a direction she hadn't been watching. It started with a rider, not one of Briggs's men this time, not someone she recognized. A woman, which was unusual enough on this trail that Hannah stopped what she was doing at the water trough and watched her come through the tree line. She was perhaps 50, well-dressed for riding with the kind of composed posture that came from a lifetime of being looked at and returning the look. Ethan came out of the house when he heard the horse. He went very still. "Mrs. Aldrich," he said. The woman dismounted with practiced ease and looked at Ethan with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was not warm, either the expression of someone who had come to deliver something unpleasant and had decided the kindest way to do it was directly. "Ethan," she said. Then she looked at Hannah. "You must be the Brooks woman." "Hannah Brooks," Hannah said. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Aldrich studied her for a moment, in the way that some older women studied younger ones, not unkindly, but completely the way you study something you're trying to understand. Then she looked back at Ethan. "I need to speak with you," she said, privately. Ethan glanced at Hannah. Hannah nodded once and went inside. She didn't listen at the door. She wasn't that kind of person. But the house was small, and the window was open, and the voices carried enough that she caught the shape of it even without every word. Margaret Aldrich was the widow of Robert Aldrich, who had been the largest landowner in the mountain county before he died 3 years ago. She sat on the board of the Caldwell Community Church and the county school committee, and she was by general agreement of everyone in the valley the closest thing this part of the territory had to a civic conscience. When Margaret Aldrich spoke, people listened. When Margaret Aldrich was displeased, people felt it. And Margaret Aldrich was displeased. Hannah caught enough of it. The word reputation came through the window more than once. The word improper once. The phrase people are talking Ethan, and not about Briggs, came through clearly enough that Hannah heard every syllable. She sat at the table, and she folded her hands, and she looked at the ledger, and she made herself breathe evenly. She had known this was coming. She had known it from the moment Caleb told her about Briggs's meeting with Mrs. Delaney. The story Briggs had fed into the town's social machinery was doing exactly what it was designed to do, shift the conversation from what Briggs was doing to what Hannah Brooks's presence on this ranch implied about the character of the people living on it. It was elegant, she thought grimly. Gerald Holt had done the same thing in Millhaven. You didn't attack the evidence directly. You attacked the credibility of the person holding it. You made the story about her instead of about the numbers. The voices outside went lower, then stopped. Ethan came back inside alone. He didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of the room with his hat in his hands, turning it, and that gesture, she'd never seen him do that before, never seen him betray that kind of unease in his body, told her everything before he opened his mouth. She's not wrong that people are talking, he said. Hannah kept her voice level. What are they saying? That it's not appropriate. A single woman living on a single man's property. He set his hat on the table. Mrs. Aldrich says it's affecting how people see the land dispute, that some of the community members who might have supported our case with Beaumont are hesitating because of the talk. Hannah looked at the table. And what do you think? A pause. I think she's right that it's a problem. The room felt very still suddenly. What kind of problem? Hannah asked. She kept her voice even because she was very practiced at keeping her voice even when something inside her was pulling tight. Ethan looked at her. She could see him choosing words carefully, the way he always chose words carefully, and she could see that this time, the care was not his usual measured precision, but something more like a man navigating something he didn't want to navigate. Beaumont's investigation depends partly on community testimony, he said. People who've seen Briggs's men on the mountain roads, people who know about Garrity. If those people aren't willing to speak up because they're busy talking about something else, about me, she said. It's not... He stopped. Started again. Hannah, I need to think about what's best for the case. She understood then exactly what he was not saying, and the understanding moved through her like cold water, swift and clarifying and deeply unpleasant. You want me to leave, she said. Temporarily. Temporarily. She said the word without inflection. She looked at the ledger on the table between them. Until after the investigation. It would be exactly what Briggs wants, she said. Her voice was still even. She was proud of that. It would remove the person who built the case. It would disrupt the continuity of the documentation. It would tell every person in this county who's watching to see whether Ethan Walker stands behind what he said outside the mercantile that day, that when it actually cost something, he didn't. Something moved across his face. Not anger. Something more complicated and less comfortable than anger. That's not, he started. I know you don't mean it that way, she said. I believe that. But I need you to think about what it looks like, Ethan. I need you to think about what message it sends when the first real social pressure arrives and you ask me to go. The silence stretched. Outside, she heard Mrs. Aldrich's horse moving. The woman had apparently decided to wait, or perhaps she was deliberately giving them a moment, which suggested more political awareness than Hannah had credited her with. I built that ledger, Hannah said quietly. I held that fence post while you drove it. I went after 21 cattle alone in a ravine 2 hours south of here, and I got them back. I sat across from Cole Beaumont, and I gave him 40 minutes of the clearest accounting he's probably ever been handed, and he knew it, and that's why his man checked the fence wire the very next morning. She paused. I have not asked you for anything that I haven't earned. I know that. he said. And the way he said it, low, rough at the edges, told her that he did know it, that he knew it completely, and that was part of what was making this so hard for him. "Then don't do this," she said. He looked at his hat on the table. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. "People are going to get hurt if the case falls apart," he said. "Garrity's already in the doctor's care. If Briggs wins this, if he gets the land and the county backs him, there are 2 other families on this mountain who will lose everything." "I know that." "The community's voice matters in a territorial investigation," he said. "Beaumont can gather evidence, but he needs people willing to testify. If the town's focused on the wrong thing, then change what the town is focused on," she said. "Talk to them. Tell them the truth about what I've done here, what I've built, what we've built. Tell them who I am." "Hannah." "Or don't." She stood. She kept her chin level. "But if I leave this mountain, because Harlan Briggs managed to use an old woman's gossip to make you question standing beside me, then you should understand that I will not be coming back. Not for the case, not for the ranch, not for anything." She said it quietly. She said it the way she said every true thing, plainly, without decoration, because the truth didn't need to be dramatic to be real. And then she picked up the ledger, and she walked out of the house and across the clearing to the bunkhouse, and she sat on her cot, and she stared at the east window, and she did not cry, because she had told herself 11 days into this journey that she wasn't going to cry, and she had kept that promise through worse things than this, and she intended to keep it now. She heard Mrs. Aldrich leave an hour later. She heard Ethan in the yard moving around the way he did when he was working something through, not still for once, but in motion, doing small tasks that kept his hands busy while his mind went somewhere private. She waited. He didn't come to the bunkhouse. By evening, she understood that he had made his choice. She packed what she'd brought: 2 dresses, a pocket knife, a tin cup, a photograph. The same things she'd carried up this mountain 7 weeks ago. She put on her boots that had been resoled twice. In the weeks she'd been here, Ethan had done it without asking, had just presented them to her one morning resoled and cleaned. She looked at them for a moment. Then she put them on. She wrote a note and left it on the table in the bunkhouse. She wasn't going to disappear without a word that wasn't who she was. The note said, "The ledger copy is under the floorboard beneath the wash basin. Beaumont knows where to find me through Caleb Morrow. The case will hold without me here. I made sure of that. HB." She went to the barn. Not the old barn, the burned one, which was still a skeleton of charred posts in the corner of the clearing. The temporary structure Ethan had thrown together in 2 days to shelter the equipment and the feed. She went to the gray mare's stall, and she spent a few minutes with her hand on the horse's neck, not doing anything, just standing there because she had gotten attached to this horse, in the way you get attached to things when your life has been stripped of most of what you thought you needed, and you find out what actually matters. "I know," she said to the mare, the way she'd said it to Ethan that night by the fire. Then she picked up her bag, and she went to the trail. She was 20 minutes into the descent when she heard a horse on the trail behind her. She didn't stop. She kept walking. The horse came alongside her and stopped, which meant whoever was riding it had stopped it, which meant they were matching her pace, which was irritating. She looked up. It wasn't Ethan. It was Caleb Morrow, sitting his horse with the particular patience of a man who had decided to be somewhere and intended to stay there until the situation resolved itself. "Going somewhere," he said. "Down the mountain," she said. She didn't stop walking. "I can see that." He moved the horse along beside her at her walking pace. "Mind telling me why?" "I expect you can guess." "I can," he said. "I also watched Ethan Walker spend the last 3 hours doing nothing useful and staring at the barn with the look of a man who has done something he already knows was wrong and is trying to figure out how to be wrong about it differently." She stopped. She turned to look at the old man. "He asked me to leave," she said. "I'm leaving." "He asked you to leave temporarily," Caleb said. "And from what I can see of who you are, you heard it as permanently. Which may be fair, given your experience of how things go." He paused. "But it might also be that you're leaving before he's had the chance to be a better man than he was this afternoon." She looked at the trail below her. The pines went down for a long way. "You rode up here to tell me that," she said. "I rode up here because I got a message from Cole Beaumont 2 hours ago," Caleb said. "And I thought both of you should hear it at the same time." He looked at her steadily. "Come back up the mountain, Hannah." She stood in the trail for a long moment. The gray of evening was settling into the pines. The mountain was quiet in its particular way, the wind in the trees, and the far-off sound of the creek, and somewhere above her, the ranch, and somewhere on the ranch, a man who had failed her today in a specific and significant way. People in her experience were not improved by having their failures confirmed. They were improved by being given the chance to do better, which was a different thing entirely. She turned around and walked back up the mountain. Caleb rode behind her and didn't say anything else, for which she was grateful. Ethan was in the yard when she came back through the tree line. He'd seen her go. He'd had to have seen her go. And now he saw her come back with Caleb behind her, and the expression on his face was the most open thing she'd ever seen on him. Something between relief and shame, and mostly shame. She stopped in front of him. She waited. "I was wrong," he said. Not preamble, not explanation. The straight fact of it said the way she stated things, plain and unadorned. "What I asked you to do was wrong. And I knew it while I was asking it, and I did it anyway because I was afraid." She held his gaze. "Afraid of what exactly?" "That the case would fall apart," he said. "That Garrity and the other families would lose their land because I couldn't manage the town's opinion." He paused. "And afraid of what it meant that I wasn't willing to do it. That managing the town's opinion mattered to me enough to ask you to leave." Another pause, harder. "That I'd become the kind of man who does that." "And," she said. "And I am not that man," he said. "I don't intend to be that man." The clearing was very quiet. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "That's all. You said you were wrong. You explained why. You said you weren't going to do it again." She held his gaze. "What else do you want me to say, Ethan?" Something in him that had been drawn very tight let go by a fraction. "Nothing," he said quietly. "Nothing else." Caleb cleared his throat with the timing of a man who had spent 15 years in a courtroom managing the temperature of rooms. "Beaumont's message," he said. They both looked at him. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "Harlan Briggs was taken in for questioning this afternoon by Sheriff Klein," he said. "Not because Klein wanted to, because Beaumont gave him no choice." He handed the paper to Ethan. "Beaumont found something." Ethan unfolded it and read it. Hannah watched his face. Then he held it out to her. She read it. Beaumont had found the 2 missing cattle, not on open mountain land, not wandering, but in a pen on a property registered to a company called Cascade Timber Holdings, which was on paper a timber acquisition firm out of Denver, which was underneath the paper owned in part by a man named Gerald Holt of Millhaven. She read that name and she read it again. Gerald Holt. Harlan Briggs and Gerald Holt were business partners. She looked up from the paper. "It wasn't a coincidence," she said slowly. "My coming here. The timing." Caleb nodded. "Beaumont traced the Cascade Timber Holdings Incorporation back 4 months. Right around the time your case in Millhaven concluded. Briggs had already been working on acquiring this mountain range for over a year, but the pace accelerated significantly when Holt came in with capital." He paused. "We believe Holt recognized your name when Briggs mentioned a woman had showed up on Walker's land. We believe the note under your bunkhouse door was Holt's idea specifically." She stood with that for a moment. Gerald Holt had not simply ruined her in Millhaven and moved on. He had followed her not literally, but financially, through the same network of money and influence that had destroyed her once already, and he had tried to use her presence here as a variable in a land grab that had been in motion long before she arrived. The cold that moved through her was different from the cold of fear. It was the cold of something clicking into place. "He thought I would run," she said. "When I got the note, he thought I'd run because I'd run before." "Probably," Caleb said. And when you didn't? He pushed harder. She looked at Ethan. The barn. That was Holt's calculation, not just Briggs's. Holt knew about the fire that killed your family. That's not public knowledge in Caldwell, but Holt's been in this county long enough through Briggs to know things. Ethan's expression had gone very still. The specific stillness she'd learned to read as anger controlled past the point where it showed. He knew about the fire, Ethan said. And he knew what it would do to you, she said. To watch it happen again. The silence was long and particular. Beaumont has enough, Caleb said quietly. The cattle, the business connection, the pattern of incidents. He's filing for a territorial injunction against Cascade Timber Holdings tomorrow morning. It freezes any land acquisition activity in this district pending investigation. He paused. And he's sending a letter to the magistrate in Millhaven requesting a review of the proceedings in the Brooks embezzlement case on the basis of newly discovered conflict of interest. Hannah heard that. She heard it clearly. She understood what it meant. She had understood intellectually for 7 weeks that what Gerald Holt had done to her might someday be reversible. That stolen truth had a way of wanting to come back to the surface. But she had not let herself feel what it would mean, because feeling things that might not happen was a luxury she hadn't been able to afford. Now she let herself feel it, just for a moment. Just the weight of it, the specific shape of what it meant that a man in a territory she'd never been to had looked at her 40 minutes of accounting and thought, this holds up. Ethan was watching her. She was not going to cry. She had decided that 11 days into this journey, and she had kept it, and she was keeping it now. All right, she said, and her voice was perfectly steady. What do we need to do next? Caleb smiled, not the slight knowing expression she'd seen from him before, but a full smile surprising on that weathered face. Beaumont wants both of you in Caldwell tomorrow morning. Official statements. He wants them on record before the injunction is filed. We'll be there, Ethan said. Together this time, Caleb said, with the mildness of a man who had made his point once and saw no reason to make it again. They ate supper late that evening. The three of them and Caleb stayed for the meal and talked. Really talked more than Hannah had heard from him in all the times she'd seen him about the 15 years of circuit court and the cases he'd seen and the specific ways people managed to be both worse and better than you expected. He told a story about a land dispute in the southern part of the territory that had gone on for 11 years before someone found a survey map in a dead man's trunk that resolved it in an afternoon. He told it well with timing, and Hannah listened and laughed at the right moments and watched Ethan across the fire doing the same, and it was the most ordinary evening she had spent in a very long time. After Caleb had gone, he was sleeping in the barn, he said, because he was too old to ride back down in the dark and too proud to admit it. Hannah and Ethan sat at the table in the main house with the lamp between them and the ledger and the Beaumont letter, and a silence that was not uncomfortable. I meant what I said, Ethan said. She looked at him. When I told you I wasn't that man. He looked at his hands on the table. I know one afternoon doesn't prove it. No, she agreed. It doesn't. I'm telling you so, you know I understand that. She held his gaze. Why does it matter that I know you understand that? He was quiet for a moment, long enough that the lamp flickered and steadied. Because you're not going to be here just until the case is settled, he said. If you're willing. That's not what I want, and I think it's not what you want either. He held her gaze. But I'm also not going to say something like that and then ask you to measure it against one afternoon where I was wrong. So I'm saying it, and I'm letting it sit. And tomorrow we go into Caldwell, and we give Beaumont our statements, and after that we come back up here, and we keep working, and I'll prove it the way you prove things, by doing it. She looked at him for a long time. Outside the window the mountain was dark, and the stars were out, and somewhere in the pines a nightbird called once and went quiet. All right, she said. It wasn't more than that. It didn't need to be. Between two people who had learned to speak primarily in action, it was plenty. She went to the bunkhouse. She unpacked her bag, the 2 dresses, the pocket knife, the tin cup, the photograph of her mother. She set the photograph on the small shelf above the cot, where she hadn't put it before, where she'd kept it in the bag, in the particular habit of someone who doesn't unpack because they don't know how long they're staying. She put it on the shelf. She looked at it for a moment, her mother's face steady and uncomplicated the way she remembered it. Then she lay down on the cot and looked at the ceiling and listened to the mountain settle into itself around her, and for the first time in a very long time, Hannah Brooks allowed herself to think about what came after. They rode into Caldwell the next morning side by side, which was not how they had ridden in before, and the difference was not lost on the people who happened to be on the main street when they came through. Hannah noticed the noticing. She didn't adjust her posture or her pace. She rode in straight and steady, the way she did everything, and she let people look because she had decided sometime in the night that she was done, managing what people thought of her at the expense of what was actually true. That particular exhaustion was finished. Beaumont was waiting at the inn with his documentation man and a young clerk who wrote quickly and without apparent interest in the human content of what he was recording, which Hannah appreciated. She'd sat across from enough people who let their opinions show while they were supposed to be recording facts. They gave their statements separately the way Beaumont wanted it, not because he distrusted them, but because separate statements that corroborated each other were more useful than a single account that could be argued as collaborative. Hannah went first. She sat across from Beaumont and the clerk, and she gave her account of every incident from her first day on the mountain to the previous evening in chronological order, with dates and specific times where she had them, and careful qualifications where she didn't. Beaumont stopped her twice. Once to ask for clarification on the fence wire tool mark description, and once to ask her to repeat word for word exactly what the two men on the trail had said the morning she and Ethan rode down. The larger man said Briggs would like a word with Ethan at his convenience, she said. And when Ethan indicated he was not available, the man said, and I'm quoting directly, "That's a real unfriendly way to talk, especially when you got company." He looked at me when he said it. "A threat," Beaumont said. "An implication," she said. "But yes." Beaumont wrote something. "And you had no prior acquaintance with either man." "No. But I'd seen the larger one in Caldwell twice before. He was at the hardware store the day I arrived in town, and again the day Ethan and I came down for supplies. I believe he's been watching the mountain access trail for some time." Beaumont looked up at her. "You notice things?" "Yes," she said. "I always have." He looked at her for a moment, with the expression she'd come to recognize the professional evaluation that had nothing to do with gossip or reputation, or what Mrs. Delaney thought over Sunday coffee. "When the Millhaven review is complete," he said, "and I expect it will take 3 to 4 weeks, you should know that Judge Pemberton intends to request your original ledger records from the assay office as part of the discovery process." He paused. "Holt's involvement in Cascade Timber Holdings constitutes a directly relevant conflict of interest in your original proceedings. That's a serious matter." She held his gaze. "I know. Do you have any documentation from your time at the assay office? Personal copies correspondence? Anything that didn't pass through the official office records?" She looked at him. "I have a copy of 6 months of ledger entries that I made for my own reference. I kept them because I had started to see the discrepancy forming, and I wanted my own record in case the office record was tampered with." She paused. "They were in a lockbox I left with my landlady in Millhaven when I was told to vacate my rooms. I wrote to her 3 weeks ago asking her to hold it." Beaumont set his pen down. "You never mentioned this before." "You never asked," she said simply. "And I wasn't certain it was still there. It's been 7 weeks." Beaumont looked at her for a long moment. "I need that lockbox, Miss Brooks." "I'll write to her today," she said. "If you can arrange a way to receive it securely, I'll give you the address." He nodded slowly. "You have been very careful," he said. Not quite a compliment. More like a professional acknowledging a professional. "I had to be," she said. "Nobody else was going to be careful on my behalf." He gave her nothing in return for that, except a slight inclination of his head. But she thought she saw something in his eyes that was the territorial investigator's equivalent of respect, which from a man like Beaumont was worth more than most people's elaborate declarations. Ethan came out of his statement 40 minutes after she'd finished hers. He didn't tell her what he'd said, and she didn't ask. What she did notice was that he walked out of that room standing slightly differently than he'd walked in. Something settled, something that had been held at a tension released. The act of stating a true thing officially on record with a clerk's pen moving, she knew that feeling. She'd felt it herself sitting across from Beaumont, watching her own account become something permanent. Caleb was on the inn's front step when they came out talking to a man Hannah didn't recognize, younger, with the look of someone who moved through official spaces regularly. "This is Deputy Marshal Reeves," Caleb said. "He came down from the territorial office with Beaumont. He has something to tell you." Reeves looked at them both. "Harlan Briggs was formally detained this morning," he said. "He'll be held pending the outcome of the injunction hearing. We've also located the 2 men from the trail." A pause. "And we found the 2 missing cattle." "Where?" Ethan said. "Same pen where Beaumont found the first 2. Turns out Cascade Timber Holdings has been using a parcel of land about 8 miles south of your property as a staging area." Reeves looked at him steadily. "There are 11 head of cattle in that pen that we can't immediately account for. We believe some may belong to other ranchers on this mountain." Hannah heard that and thought immediately of old man Garrity, who had sold his land after his barn burned, who was still in the doctor's care with a broken leg and a memory that came and went. "Garrity ran about 40 head, she said, before he sold." Reeves looked at her. "Yes, ma'am. We're looking into that." Ethan took his hat off and looked at it, a gesture she'd come to read as the physical equivalent of absorbing something significant without letting it become larger than it needed to be. "What happens now?" he said. To Beaumont, who had come out behind them. "The injunction freezes Cascade Timber's activity in this district," Beaumont said. "The criminal investigation into the property damage and the incidents involving Mr. Garrity will run separately through the Territorial Marshal's office." He paused. "As for your land, it's registered, it's documented, and the record is clean. As long as you continue to operate it as a working ranch, there is no legal mechanism by which it can be taken from you." He said it plainly. Not triumphantly, not with drama. Just the flat truth of it stated like a fence post set properly in solid ground. Ethan nodded. "Thank you." "Thank Miss Brooks," Beaumont said, and got back on his horse. The street was watching. Hannah was aware of it in the particular way she'd become aware of being observed over the past 7 weeks. Not paranoid, just accurate. Mrs. Delaney was visible at the corner of the post office. The hardware store man was in his doorway. 2 women she didn't know had paused their conversation across the street. She was done performing for any of them. She turned to Ethan. "I need to go to the postal office and write to my landlady in Millhaven about the lockbox." "I'll wait," he said. She went in and wrote the letter and paid the postage, and came back out, and Ethan was where he'd said he'd be, which in her experience was as significant a thing as a man could demonstrate. They were almost to the horses when Margaret Aldrich appeared. She came from the direction of the church, walking with the purpose of a woman who had made a decision and intended to act on it. She stopped in front of them both. Hannah watched her. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Aldrich said. She said it to Ethan first, then turned to Hannah. "And I owe you a larger one." The street was still watching. Hannah suspected Margaret Aldrich knew that, suspected that the location of this apology was not accidental. "I repeated things I had no way of verifying," Mrs. Aldrich said, "to a man I should have known better than to trust, because he presented himself as being concerned about community values, and I allowed that framing to do my thinking for me." She held Hannah's gaze. "I've lived in this county long enough to know that women who arrive without resources and without connections are treated as suspicious before they're treated as anything else. I know that. I've seen it. And I let it happen anyway because the framing was comfortable." She paused. "That was wrong. I am sorry for it." The silence on the street was the kind that meant everyone within earshot had stopped moving. Hannah held the woman's gaze. She could feel Ethan beside her, still and quiet in the way he was still and quiet when he was watching something matter. "I appreciate that," Hannah said. She said it simply without performance. "I know it wasn't easy to say in public." "Good things rarely are," Mrs. Aldrich said. She looked at Ethan. "The community church's auxiliary fund has a provision for disaster relief. I'd like to discuss the barn with you." She said it the way she said everything, as a statement, not a question, which meant she'd already made up her mind and was simply informing them of the direction. "Come see me when you're ready." Then she turned and walked back the way she'd come, which left the two of them standing in the middle of the street with most of Caldwell still watching, and something in the air that had shifted slightly but perceptibly the way air shifts when the wind changes direction. Ethan looked at Hannah. She looked at him. "Ready to go home?" she said. He held her gaze for a moment. She heard the word she'd used, home, and she'd meant it deliberately, and she let him see that. "Yes," he said. They rode back up the mountain. The trouble arrived 7 days later in the form of a man Hannah hadn't expected. She was at the water trough checking the level when a single rider came through the tree line, not from the main trail from the east, which was unusual. He came slowly, which was either caution or calculation, and he stopped his horse at the edge of the clearing and looked at her. He was perhaps 55. Well dressed in a way that was slightly wrong for mountain terrain. Not a working man's clothes, a town man's clothes, a man who was more comfortable in offices than on horseback. He had a face she had never seen before, and an expression she recognized immediately. It was the expression of a man who had come to negotiate because his other options had run out. "Miss Brooks," he said. He knew her name. That alone made her go careful. "Yes," she said. "My name is Leonard Holt," he said. "Gerald Holt is my brother." She kept her expression level. Her heart was doing something fast and unpleasant that she didn't let reach her face. "What do you want, Mr. Holt?" "To talk," he said. "Before this goes further." He glanced toward the house. "Is Walker here?" "He's on the east pasture," she said. "I can get him if you need him." "I came to speak to you," he said, specifically. She looked at him. She looked at his hands. No weapon she could see, and he had the posture of a man who was not accustomed to physical confrontation. "Get off your horse," she said, "and talk." He dismounted. He held his hat in front of him, which told her he was nervous, which told her he had something to lose. "Gerald made a mistake," he said. "Gerald made a series of calculated decisions," she said. "That's different from a mistake." He flinched slightly. "He made decisions that were wrong," he said, revising. "I'm not going to argue that. I've been arguing it with him for 2 years. He looked at her. "I came to tell you that I'm prepared to make a statement to the Millhaven magistrate. Voluntary. Unprompted by the territorial investigation." A pause. "I was there when Gerald moved the money. I didn't know at the time what he intended to do with it. When I understood, I said nothing. That was wrong." He looked at his hat. "I'm correcting it." Hannah stood with that for a moment. In her experience, which was now a fairly considerable experience of the ways people could wrong her and the ways they occasionally tried to make it right, there were 2 kinds of confession: the kind people made because they wanted to feel better, and the kind they made because they understood that the wrong thing had been done, and the record needed to be corrected regardless of how it felt. She looked at Leonard Holt and tried to figure out which kind this was. "Why now?" she said. "Why not 2 years ago?" "Because 2 years ago, Gerald told me you would disappear quietly, and no one would need to know," he said. "And you didn't." Something moved across his face. "You came up this mountain, and you built a case that a territorial investigator is going to use to untangle my brother's business dealings, all the way back to when they started." He paused. "If I'm going to be associated with any part of this, I'd rather be associated with the part where someone told the truth." Hannah looked at him for a long time. "You'll put it in writing," she said. "Dated, signed, witnessed." "Yes." "And you'll appear before the Millhaven magistrate if the territorial investigation requires it." "Yes." "And you understand that what you tell them may result in charges against Gerald." Leonard Holt looked at her. His expression was tired in a way that went deeper than the ride up the mountain. "Gerald made his choices," he said. "I've made mine." She pulled in a breath. Let it out. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get water, and when Ethan comes back, we'll take your statement down in writing. We have a ledger." She paused. "We're very good at ledgers." He sat. What Hannah did not say what she carried inside her for the rest of that afternoon, while Leonard Holt's statement was being taken down in the precise clean columns she'd been using for 9 weeks, was the specific quality of feeling she had about this moment. It wasn't triumphant. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a thing that had been upside down for 2 years slowly, with considerable effort, and the help of people she hadn't expected turning right side up. The lockbox arrived from Millhaven 11 days later. Her landlady had kept it. She had written back in the same week that Hannah had written to her a letter that arrived the day after Leonard Holt had ridden back down the mountain. The letter said, "I told them I didn't have anything of yours. I hope that was right. Whatever's in that box, it seemed like the kind of thing you'd want kept." Hannah had read that letter twice and then folded it carefully and put it with her photograph of her mother. When the lockbox came, she took it to Beaumont herself. She sat across from him one more time in the inn's meeting room, and she opened it, and she laid out 6 months of ledger entries, her handwriting, her dates, her numbers, and she watched Beaumont's face as he read them and understood what he was reading. "These are prior to the discrepancy," he said. "Yes, the pattern of the original entries makes the alteration visible. Whoever changed the records didn't change the foundational accounting rhythm. They couldn't, because they didn't understand it well enough. The numbers add up. The methodology doesn't match." Beaumont looked at her across the table. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I'm going to recommend to Judge Pemberton that the original proceedings in Millhaven be vacated." She heard that word. Vacated. She had not let herself want that word. "On what grounds?" she said, because she needed to hear the grounds said out loud. "Fraudulent suppression of evidence, conflict of interest on the part of the presiding mine authority, and the testimony of a material witness who was not called at the original hearing." He closed the lockbox. Leonard Holt's statement, combined with this documentation and the pattern established by the Cascade Timber investigation, constitutes a clear picture of orchestrated misconduct. He looked at her steadily. "You were not a thief, Miss Brooks. You were a problem someone needed to remove, and they found a cheap way to do it." She looked at the table. She was not going to cry. She had told herself that in the beginning, and she had kept it through every hard day and every slammed door and every moment on this mountain when it would have been easier to let something break. She kept it now, too. She just nodded once and said, "Thank you," and stood up and picked up the lockbox and walked out into the Caldwell Street, where Ethan was waiting with the horses, and the particular look on his face that meant he had been watching the door of the inn for the past 45 minutes, and was very deliberately not showing how much he'd been watching the door. She stopped in front of him. "Well," he said. "He's recommending the proceedings be vacated," she said. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he reached out and took the lockbox from her hand because she was holding it in a way that suggested her grip had gotten less reliable, and he set it in the saddlebag, and when he straightened up, he was close enough that she could see the specific thing happening in his expression. The thing he'd been keeping carefully managed since the first day she'd walked out of the tree line and asked for work. "Ethan," she said. "I know," he said. The same 2 words she'd said to him the night of the fire, the same weight in them. She looked at him. "What do you know?" He was quiet for a moment. In the middle of the Caldwell Street, with people moving around them and horses at the rail and the summer heat pressing down from above and radiating back from the earth. He was quiet, in the way he was quiet when he was about to say something he'd been carrying for a long time and had finally decided to put down. "I know that you came up this mountain with a carpet bag and a pocket knife and a name somebody had worked very hard to ruin," he said. "And in 9 weeks, you built a legal case that a territorial investigator is using to dismantle a company you recovered 21 head of cattle alone. You kept my land from being taken, and you gave me back something I didn't know I was still missing." He held her gaze. "I know that I almost let them talk me into asking you to leave, And that's the closest I've come to doing something I couldn't fix." He paused. "And I know that I would like you to stay. Not for the wages, not for the case. For the reason that this ranch is better with you on it, and I am better with you on it. And I have known that longer than I've been willing to say it." The street moved around them. Neither of them moved. "That's a lot of words," she said, "for a man who doesn't use many." "I've been saving them," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. At the steadiness of him, the specific quality of his stillness that she had learned over 9 weeks was not distance, but depth. The stillness of a man who felt things fully and carefully and didn't spend those feelings lightly. "I'm not easy," she said. "I keep my own records. I argue when I think I'm right. I will not leave a second time if you ask me to." "I'm not asking you to," he said. "I'm asking the opposite." "Then yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes." "Yes," she said again simply because it was the right word, and it didn't need company. He reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face. Not a romantic gesture, or not only that, something more like a claiming in the plain language of a man who communicated through action. A thing done, a thing real. She leaned into it slightly. Just slightly. Just enough to say that she felt it, and she meant the feeling. "We should go home," she said. He smiled. It was the first full smile she'd ever seen from him. Not the slight shift at the corner of his mouth. Not the shadow of one, but the real thing arriving on his face, like something that had been waiting for the right moment and had decided this was it. "Yes," he said. "We should." The hearing was 3 weeks later. It was held not in the Caldwell Church Hall, as originally planned, but in the larger space of the county courthouse, because the crowd that arrived on that morning was larger than the church could hold. They came from the mountain ranches and the valley farms, and from Caldwell itself, and they came because Beaumont's investigation had become by then something the whole county had an opinion about. Ethan and Hannah sat together at the front. Caleb Morrow sat beside them because he had been involved in this from the first hour, and he intended to see it through. Old man Garrity was there, brought down from the doctor's house in a chair because his leg was still healing, but he had refused to miss it, and his presence, that stubborn, indomitable 83-year-old presence, had done more for the community's willingness to speak than any argument Beaumont could have made. Deputy Marshal Reeves read the charges. Harlan Briggs sat at the opposing table with a lawyer from Denver who had the look of a man who already knew how this was going to go and was calculating the terms of the negotiation. Gerald Holt was not present. He was in Millhaven facing his own proceeding, but Leonard Holt sat in the second row, which was its own kind of statement. Mrs. Delaney was in the back. She had come, Hannah noted alone. Mrs. Aldrich was in the third row with the church auxiliary treasurer and 2 women from the school committee, and when Hannah glanced back at her, she received a slight deliberate nod. The hearing itself was not dramatic in the way that things are dramatic in stories. It was the particular grinding, important drama of fact being established in a public place by people who had agreed to be bound by it. Witnesses gave accounts. Documents were read. Beaumont spoke with the precision of a man who had spent years learning how to make complicated things clear. Halfway through, the Denver lawyer leaned over to Harlan Briggs and said something quiet. Briggs listened. His expression did something complicated and then flattened. He accepted the terms. The injunction against Cascade Timber Holdings was made permanent. Briggs was charged with criminal interference with registered property and conspiracy to defraud in connection with the Garrity land sale, the latter charge carrying significant weight because Garrity had signed that sale agreement in a hospital bed after being pushed down a ravine. 2 of Briggs's men were charged separately. The third cooperated and received a reduced arrangement in exchange for his account of the instructions he'd received, which implicated Holt in Denver directly, and gave Beaumont the last piece he needed to close the circle. When it was over, when the judge had ruled, and the room was releasing the particular held breath of a community that had been waiting to know how things would go, Caleb Morrow leaned over and said quietly to no one in particular, "That's what a clean ledger does." Hannah heard him. She didn't say anything. Ethan's hand found hers under the table and held it. She had been waiting for that. Not consciously, not impatiently, but in the way you wait for something that's been true for a while to simply be acknowledged. His hand was warm and rough, and it held hers the way he did most things steadily without drama, with the full weight of intention behind it. She held on. Outside afterward, in the noise and movement of a courthouse, emptying into a summer afternoon, Mrs. Aldrich appeared at her elbow. "I've spoken to the auxiliary," she said. "We can have the barn raised in 3 weeks if we start coordinating now. There are 6 families who've already said they'll send men and materials." She paused. "It's the least we can do." Hannah looked at her. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Aldrich." "Margaret," the woman said. Hannah looked at her for a moment. "Margaret," she said. Garrity stopped them on the way to the horses, sitting in his chair, with his bandaged leg straight out in front of him, and his eyes sharp and clear in the way of very old men whose bodies were unreliable, but whose minds were not. "Miss Brooks," he said. She stopped. "Mr. Garrity." He looked at her for a long moment. "My granddaughter's been running my place since I sold it, trying to keep the stock together on leased land. If Briggs goes to trial and the sale is reviewed—" He stopped, started again. "If the land comes back, I'd be needing help." She held his gaze. "I know a judge who knows how to read a land sale agreement," she said. "And I know how to build a record. If you want, when things are settled, I'll help you build one." His eyes were brighter than she'd expected. "I'd be grateful," he said. Ethan helped him to his chair more comfortably and said a few quiet words she didn't catch, and then they walked to the horses, and the summer afternoon was loud with the specific noise of a community that had just agreed on something together, which was a particular and valuable kind of noise. On the ride home, an hour into the mountain trail, where the pines had closed in and the town was below them, and the air was clean and old and smelled of resin and high summer, Ethan said, "I'm going to rebuild the barn better than it was." "I know," she said. "North wall's been bothering me for 3 years. This is a chance to fix the foundation. I'll help. I know you will." "I know you." They rode in comfortable silence for a while. The mountain held them the way it had held her since the first day she'd come up through the trees with a blister on her heel, and a carpet bag that was too heavy, and a name that someone had spent money to ruin. It was her name again now. Clean and hers, the way it had always actually been, even when no one would look at it straight. "Ethan," she said. When Caleb said you lost your family in the fire." She kept her eyes on the trail. "You never talk about it." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "You don't have to. I know." Another pause longer, the kind where she could tell he was deciding something. "They took me in when I was 9, he said. "After my own people died. Robert and May Walker. They had a daughter, Clara. She was older than me by 4 years. It was Clara who told Robert to take me in. He was going to say no, said they didn't have the room, and Clara said, 'You make the room.'" A pause. "She was 11 years old, and she told her father, 'You make the room.'" Hannah rode beside him and let him have the space of the silence. "The fire started in a drought summer," he said. "I was at the lower pasture. By the time I saw the smoke—" He stopped. "By the time I got back, there was nothing I could do." He was quiet for a moment. "I've spent 6 years thinking that if I'd been closer, if I'd been watching better." "Ethan." "I know," he said. "I know that's not—" "No," she said. "I know. I was going to say I know that feeling. The one where you replay what you could have done differently. I've been doing it about Millhaven for 2 years." She paused. "At some point you have to decide that the thing that happened doesn't get to be the whole story. That there's something after it." He looked at her sideways. "Clara would have liked you," he said. She felt that land. Felt the specific weight of it. Not grief, not exactly, but the way love and loss were the same thing seen from different directions. "I'd have liked her," she said. They came through the tree line into the clearing as the afternoon was going gold and the cattle were where they were supposed to be, and the temporary structure stood where the barn had been, and everything was as they'd left it. The work of two people on 412 acres of mountain land, registered, documented, and now at considerable cost and effort, permanently theirs to keep. Hannah dismounted and stood for a moment in the clearing. She thought about the water trough in Caldwell, the 7 slammed doors, the dry biscuit she'd eaten in halves, and the old man who'd told her to go west because he'd known her father and he'd known what she was. She thought about Ethan catching her weight at the fence post and the ledger by lamplight, and his hand under the courthouse table, and Clara Walker, who at 11 years old had told her father, "You make the room." She thought about what it meant that she had come up this mountain with nothing except what she actually was, and that it had turned out to be enough. Ethan came and stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he said. She looked at the clearing, at the cattle and the temporary barn, and the main house with its weathered log walls, and the east window that caught the morning light. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I'd like to plant a kitchen garden on the south side of the house. Before the summer's out, there's still time for some things." He looked at her. "You can do that." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you because it's your land." "Our land," he said. She turned to look at him. He held her gaze with that particular steadiness, the depth that she'd mistaken in the beginning for distance and had learned over 9 weeks was something much rarer and much more valuable. "Our land," he said again. Clear and plain and permanent, the way he said everything that mattered. And Hannah Brooks, who had walked up this mountain with nothing but what she was, and had found that it was enough, looked at the man standing beside her in the afternoon light, and understood that this was what came after. Not the absence of hard things. Not a life without wire cutters in the night, or notes under doors, or men with money who thought women without it could be swept aside. But this, a cleared space on a mountain, a ledger with clean numbers, a man who communicated primarily through what he did, and who had over the course of 9 weeks done everything that mattered. A home that had been earned and therefore would hold. "All right then," she said, and they went to work.